Hey guys, tonight we begin with the rowdy, smoky, and slightly sticky world of the Medieval Tavern. You know, the movie version, warm firelight, foamy ale, good company. Accurate. Mostly what they quietly left out is the smell, the fleas, and the man sitting next to you who has not bathed since the previous rain. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with a question people almost never ask. What exactly was a medieval tavern? Because here is the thing. It wasn't just a pub. It wasn't just a restaurant. It wasn't just a hotel. It was all three of those things at once, crammed into a space the size of your living room, operating under laws that changed depending on which king was having a bad year, and regulated by a church that officially disapproved of everything that happened inside, while simultaneously sending its clergy there for a quiet drink. The medieval tavern was, in the most accurate sense, the beating social heart of every town, village, and crossroads settlement in Europe for roughly 1,000 years. Which sounds impressive until you walk inside and realize the heart in question is pumping something that smells like fermented regret. There is actually an important distinction to make here, because medieval people were very specific about their drinking establishments, in a way that would confuse most modern visitors. A tavern, strictly speaking, was a place that sold wine. An alehouse was a place that sold ale. An inn was a place that provided lodging, food, and drink to travellers. In practice, by the later medieval period, these distinctions had blurred considerably, and most establishments sold all three, served food, and rented sleeping space on the floor, whether you wanted it or not. For the purposes of tonight, when we say tavern, we mean all of it. The drink, the food, the noise, the company, and the very particular experience of spending an evening in a medieval drinking establishment. Translation: buckle up, because it only gets better from here. And by better, I mean worse. You arrive in a medieval town sometime in the mid-afternoon. Let's say it is the 14th century, which means the Black Death has already visited at least once. The roads are either mud or frozen mud, depending on the season. And you've been travelling for 3 days on a horse that has opinions about everything. You are tired. Your back aches in places you didn't know had places. You smell like travel, which is a generous word for it. You need ale, food, and a flat surface to lie on before tomorrow morning. And as you ride through the town, gate past the guard who looks at you with the professional suspicion of someone paid to look at everyone with professional suspicion, you start scanning the street for signs of a tavern. Finding the tavern is, in theory, easy. In a medieval town, nearly every other building is a drinking establishment of some kind. Studies of late medieval English towns suggest that 1 in 12 buildings sold ale or wine at some point. That is not a neighbourhood bar on every block. That is a bar every 2 buildings. You are essentially swimming in options. The hard part is finding a good one, which in medieval terms means one where the ale is fresh enough to drink without praying first. The food is cooked through to the centre, and the probability of waking up missing your purse is below 50%. The way to identify a tavern is to look for the ale stake. This is a long pole, sometimes a bush, sometimes a bundle of greenery, hung over the door when fresh ale was ready to sell. It was the medieval equivalent of an open sign. The idea was borrowed from Roman times and persisted with remarkable stubbornness throughout the medieval period. When you see the bush hanging over the door, the ale is fresh. When it comes down, the barrel is empty. When there is no bush at all, either they're out of ale or the alewife is having a day. You see the bush hanging from a building halfway down the main street. The building itself is a low timber framed structure with a thatched roof that has seen better decades and walls that lean slightly to the left in a way that suggests either artistic intention or structural compromise. Smoke is leaking from every possible gap in the thatch, which means the fire is going, which means warmth, which means you dismount before your horse even stops moving. The first thing you notice before you even open the door is the smell, not in a good way, or rather, not in an exclusively good way. There is something appealing in the mixture, the sweet fermented grain of ale, the wood smoke curling out into the afternoon air, the faint suggestion of roasting meat from somewhere inside. These are ancient, primal smells that mean food and warmth and shelter, and some part of your body responds to them before your brain has a chance to weigh in. But underneath those appealing layers is something else. Something earthier. Something that smells like wet wool, unwashed bodies, tallow candles burning down to their last, stale ale soaked into wood floors over years and years of daily spillage. And something you can't quite identify, but suspect might be the accumulated residue of everyone who has eaten, drunk, and lived in this room before you. You push open the door anyway. Because what is the alternative? Sleeping outside. Inside, the tavern is darker than you expected. The windows are small, covered in oiled parchment, rather than glass, because glass is extraordinarily expensive, and oiled parchment does the job of letting in a little light while keeping out most of the wind. There are tallow candles on the tables and a torch or two in iron brackets on the wall, but the main source of light is the fire in the central hearth, and it is also the main source of heat and the main source of the thick blue-grey smoke that hangs at roughly shoulder height throughout the entire room, because the chimney is either inadequate or blocked or both. Your eyes take a moment to adjust. When they do, you see the following. A room approximately the size of a large modern bedroom, maybe 20 feet by 15 feet, if you are being generous, packed with rough wooden tables and benches, worn smooth by generations of elbows and backsides. The floor is beaten earth covered with rushes, though the rushes in the corner by the door are so old and so matted with what you choose to interpret as mud that they have essentially become the floor. The walls are bare plaster, dark with smoke. The ceiling is low enough that a tall man would need to duck under the main beam, and several people in the room clearly learned this, the hard way based on the number of them, sitting in that particular posture of men who have recently hit their heads. There are maybe 15 people in here. This is a moderately busy afternoon. A group of labourers in the corner, still in their work clothes, their hands stained with the particular pigment of their trade. Clay workers judging by the red dust still in the creases of their knuckles. Two merchants at a central table, talking in the low, careful voices of men discussing money in a public place. A young priest sitting alone near the fire with a cup he keeps refilling with the studied casualness of someone who is definitely not a priest. You understand. Just an ordinary man who happens to be dressed like one. An old woman in the far corner who may or may not be sleeping. And behind the counter, which is simply a thick plank balanced on two barrels, the woman who runs this establishment, looking at you with the appraising expression of someone who has seen every type of traveller this road produces, and formed accurate opinions about all of them within seconds. She is the alewife, or she might be the tapster or the hostess, depending on which century you've landed in and what corner of Europe you are in. What she absolutely is, without question, is the most important person in this building, and possibly on this street. The production and sale of ale in medieval Europe was, for a significant portion of the medieval period, largely a female enterprise. Brewing was domestic work, which in medieval thinking meant women's work, and women ran alehouses and taverns, in numbers that would surprise you if you've absorbed too many Hollywood tavern scenes, full of male landlords with red faces and enormous moustaches. The alewife brewed the ale, managed the establishment, handled the money, and maintained order in a room full of tired drunk, and occasionally belligerent men, usually while also managing a household, raising children, and feeding animals. If you think that sounds like a lot, you are right. If you want to tell her it sounds like a lot, she will look at you with an expression that communicates without words that she has been managing this situation since before you were born, and does not require your observations. You approach the counter. The alewife looks you up and down with the calm efficiency of someone calculating your approximate wealth, your probable drinking capacity, and your likelihood of causing trouble, all in roughly 3 seconds. You ask for ale. She does not ask what kind, because there is what she has brewed today, and there is nothing else. She takes a wooden cup, fills it from the barrel behind her, and sets it in front of you. The cup is dark with use. The ale inside is a cloudy amber colour, darker than any modern beer you've seen, with a slightly thick consistency, and a yeasty smell so powerful it hits you before the cup reaches your lip. You drink. And here is where the medieval tavern experience diverges sharply from anything you've had before, because medieval ale is not beer. Not in the way you know beer. Modern beer is brewed with hops, which give it bitterness and act as a preservative. Hops didn't become standard in English brewing until the 15th and 16th centuries, meaning that for most of the medieval period, ale was brewed without them. Instead, the flavour came entirely from the malt, and the drink was sweetened, and sometimes seasoned with a mixture of herbs called groot, a proprietary blend that might include bog myrtle, yarrow, horehound, wild rosemary, and whatever else the brewer thought appropriate that week. The result is thick, sweet, slightly sour, nutritionally dense, and not particularly strong by modern standards. Most everyday ale was around 1 to 3% alcohol. Strong ale for festivals and special occasions might reach 4 or 5%. This is not the high-octane fuel of your imagination. This is closer to liquid bread, and it was consumed in quantities that would alarm you, because for many medieval people, it was the safest thing to drink. Let's talk about that for a moment because it is important. Medieval water was not safe to drink in any town or village of significant size. Wastewater, animal waste, tannery runoff, butcher's blood, and human sewage all found their way into the same water sources that people drew from for drinking and cooking. Dysentery, typhoid, and various other waterborne diseases were constants of medieval life. Ale, brewed by boiling water with grain and allowed to ferment, was considerably safer. The fermentation process killed many pathogens. The low alcohol content added another layer of protection. The result was that ale was not just a social drink, it was a dietary staple. Men, women, and children drank it daily. Historical records suggest consumption of somewhere between 1 and 4 litres per person, per Dalton Y in some households. That is not a typo. 4 litres every day. Not because everyone in medieval Europe was a functioning alcoholic, though no comment there, but because when the alternative is water that might kill you, the fermented option starts looking very reasonable very quickly. You are on your second cup now, which the alewife refilled without asking, and you are beginning to understand why the room feels slightly warmer, and the conversation slightly more animated than it did when you arrived. The ale is working. It is not getting you drunk in the modern sense, but it is taking the edge off the journey. The aches in your back, the worry about tomorrow, the ambient anxiety of being alive in the 14th century. This, you realize, is the actual function of the medieval tavern. Not debauchery, not disorder, just relief. A place where the grinding difficulty of daily life pauses for a few hours, where the ale loosens the knot in your shoulders, and where the fire is someone else's problem to maintain. The merchants at the central table have been joined by a third man, and their conversation has grown more animated. From fragments you can catch across the room, they're discussing road conditions between here and the next town, which is actually useful information. Medieval travellers relied heavily on tavern intelligence networks. There were no maps available to common people, no road signs beyond the occasional carved stone, and no reliable way to know what conditions you'd find ahead, except to ask people who had come from there. Taverns were information exchanges. News travelled through them. Rumours about war, plague, taxation, disputed inheritances, royal appointments, and local scandals all moved through the tavern network faster than any official messenger could carry them. If you wanted to know what was happening in the world, you came here. If you wanted to know what was happening in the next village, you came here. If you wanted to know who owed money to whom and why there was tension between the miller and the blacksmith, you sat in the corner for 20 minutes and just listened. The tavern was the medieval internet. Slower, obviously, smellier. Certainly. But operating on the same basic principle of information spreading outward from node to node through human contact. The priest by the fire has finished his second cup and has not moved. He is staring into the flames with the comfortable vacancy of a man who is taking a well-deserved break from his official identity. Priests and monks in taverns were a constant source of irritation for the medieval church hierarchy, and a constant source of amusement for everyone else. The church officially forbade clergy from frequenting taverns, playing dice, getting drunk in public, and generally behaving like normal human beings. The clergy responded to these prohibitions with the same enthusiasm with which they followed all the others, which is to say they absolutely continued to do all of those things while developing an impressive range of justifications for why their particular situation was different. The local parish priest was a regular at his village alehouse. Monks on journeys stopped at taverns with a frequency that suggests divine guidance in the direction of ale barrels. University students in holy orders were famously enthusiastic tavern patrons. The Goliards, those wandering scholars and minor clergy who wrote bawdy drinking songs and poetry in the 12th and 13th centuries, left us an entire literary genre celebrating tavern life, in terms the Vatican found deeply unhelpful. The priest by the fire is not doing anything scandalous. He is simply sitting in a tavern, drinking ale, staring at the fire. The fact that this is technically prohibited makes the expression on his face, that particular blend of quiet contentment and studied innocence, somewhat more entertaining than it would otherwise be. The labourers in the corner are getting louder. This is standard tavern physics. Ale goes in, volume goes up. They're not arguing yet, just talking with the rising animation of men whose workday is finally over, and who have perhaps 4 or 5 hours before they need to sleep. The conversation is the same conversation workers have had in taverns for 800 years. The difficulty of their work, the unreasonableness of their employer, the quality of the current ale compared to last week's ale, who in the village is sleeping with someone they shouldn't be, and whether the weather tomorrow will be manageable or catastrophic. If you were to transcribe this conversation and translate it into modern English, it would be almost completely recognizable. Humans complaining about work and gossiping about neighbors is a technology that has not needed upgrading. Food. Let's talk about food, because by now you are hungry in that specific hollow way that comes after a long day of physical travel, and the smell of cooking from the back room is making the decision for you. The alewife, or her husband, or whoever is working the kitchen tonight, offers a limited selection. Limited is a generous word. There is pottage. There is bread. There might be meat, depending on the day, the season, and your ability to pay. There might be cheese. That is essentially the menu. You are not at a restaurant. You are at a place that primarily sells drinks and feeds you as a secondary service, mostly because hungry drinkers leave earlier than fed drinkers. The pottage arrives in a thick earthenware bowl. Pottage is the base food of medieval life. A thick porridge. Stew made from whatever was available. Dried peas and beans. Oats. Barley. Root vegetables. Onions. Leeks. Whatever herbs grew in the kitchen garden. It is the medieval equivalent of a protein shake. Nutritionally efficient. Filling, cheap to produce. And profoundly boring after you've eaten it for the 400th time. On good days, with a prosperous alewife and a cooperative market, the pottage might contain a small amount of salted pork or bacon, some thickening from bone broth, and enough fresh herbs to suggest someone thought about flavour. On average days, it contains what is available. On difficult days, it contains ambition and prayer. The bowl in front of you is somewhere in the middle, hot, thick, vaguely savoury, and asking no questions you are not prepared to answer. You eat it with a piece of bread. The bread is dense and dark, made from rye or a mixture of rye and wheat, or sometimes oats, and whatever else got swept into the grain bag. It is not delicious, but it is filling, and it does not taste of anything actively troubling. In the context of the medieval tavern, this counts as a win. If you want meat, it will cost you more. Not prohibitively more, but enough that you feel it. The meat in a medieval tavern is most likely salted, dried, or smoked, because fresh meat spoils in hours without refrigeration, and the tavern does not have a reliable cold supply. What arrives is a rough cut of salted pork or a leg of preserved mutton, grilled over the fire until it is cooked through to everyone's satisfaction, which is to say until it is very much cooked through, because medieval cooks had no way to check internal temperature, and their response to this uncertainty was to err heavily on the side of more fire. The outside is charred. The inside is dry. It is chewy in a way that requires actual work from your jaw. You eat it with determination and residual hunger, and the understanding that in a world where meat is expensive and preservation is imperfect, the fact that this animal is in front of you at all represents a small logistical miracle. The cheese, if there is cheese, is a revelation. Medieval cheese making was excellent. The monks were particularly gifted, their monasteries producing aged varieties of real complexity and character. The cheese in a tavern might be a younger, simpler version of these monastic recipes, but it is genuinely good. Sharp, earthy, slightly crumbly, the kind of cheese that makes the bread and the mediocre ale taste better by association. You eat more of it than you intended. By now the room has changed. More people have arrived in the hour since you sat down, and the volume has risen accordingly. The two merchants have been joined by a man who is describing something at length, with the emphatic hand gestures of someone who wants everyone in a 10-foot radius to understand how very badly he was treated. The Labourer's Corner has acquired 3 new members and what appears to be an argument about dice, though whether the argument is about the game currently in progress or about a game that happened previously is not clear. Someone near the door has started singing something, not with musical ambition, but with the unself-conscious volume of a person who has had enough ale that they have forgotten other people can hear them. The song is bawdy. You can tell from the reaction of the other patrons, who are either joining in or rolling their eyes depending on their disposition. Music in the medieval tavern was omnipresent and largely informal. Travelling musicians did pass through taverns and would play for food, drink, and whatever coins could be gathered from a crowd. But the majority of tavern music came from the patrons themselves. Singing while drinking was not considered unusual or embarrassing. It was standard communal behavior. Songs were passed through the oral tradition, everyone learning the words through repetition until they became common property. Drinking songs, work songs, love songs, political songs, songs making very specific anatomical jokes about well-known local figures. All of these moved through the tavern network like any other piece of information, gaining verses, losing verses, and evolving with each new generation of drinkers. The result was a rich and perpetually changing musical culture that has been almost entirely lost because almost none of it was ever written down. What we have are fragments, a few drinking songs preserved by the Goliards, some folk tunes that survived in later manuscript collections, a handful of bawdy verses that got copied down because someone found them funny enough to record. The vast majority is simply gone, dissolved into the accumulated noise of 10 centuries of tavern evenings. Dice. Let's talk about dice, because the argument in the corner is getting more pointed, and the word dice has been said with increasing intensity by a man who is gesturing at another man's hand with the moral conviction of someone who has just been cheated in a way he cannot prove. Gambling was one of the primary activities in any medieval tavern, and dice was the most popular form of it. The medieval church disapproved of gambling with a consistency that suggests it understood perfectly well what was happening in every alehouse in Christendom. The reasoning was theological. Gambling was viewed as an attempt to manipulate fortune, which was in God's hands, which meant gambling was essentially an argument with providence. This did not stop anyone. What it did was create an extensive literature of anti-gambling sermons, court records of gambling, related disputes, and periodic municipal legislation, attempting to ban or restrict dice games in taverns, all of which can be read today as evidence that gambling in taverns was relentlessly, enthusiastically, unstoppably continuous. The dice of the medieval period were made from bone or ivory, and they were not always fair. The production of weighted dice, loaded to favour certain numbers, was a known and practised craft. A skilled cheat could work a loaded die into a game, collect winnings for several rounds before detection, and exit the premises before consequences arrived. Less skilled cheats did this too, with the difference that consequences tended to arrive sooner and at speed. The man in the corner who is now standing has been the victim of this, or believes he has been, which in the immediate term amounts to the same thing. The alewife is watching the situation with the expression of a woman who has managed this precise development before and has a procedure ready. Violence in medieval taverns was real and documented, but it was also less constant than the movies suggest. Most evenings in most taverns ended without bloodshed. This is partly because ale, while consumed in quantity, was not particularly strong. It is partly because most people in a tavern had to work tomorrow and preferred to sleep without injuries. And it is partly because the social dynamics of a small community meant that the man across the table was probably your neighbour, your co-worker's brother, or someone who owed your cousin money, and attacking him created complications that outlasted any particular grievance. What the historical records do show is that when tavern violence did occur, it often started with dice or accusations of cheating, or with someone saying something about someone else's wife, mother, or livestock that escalated past the point of no return. The weapons used were often improvised, a wooden cup, a bench, whatever was closest. The injuries were mostly cuts and bruises. Deaths occurred, but were not the norm. The local constable or night watch in towns that had one would eventually appear and impose order, usually by the blunt method of removing the loudest participants from the premises. The argument in the corner has been resolved, not satisfactorily, based on the expression of the man who is now sitting back down with his arms crossed, but temporarily. The alewife said something in a low, firm voice, and the standing man sat down. This is the alewife's superpower. The ability to de-escalate a tavern dispute through tone, presence, and the implicit reminder that she controls the ale and can stop providing it at any time, is an authority that requires no physical size, no weapon, and no official backing. It is simply social leverage applied with precision. The dice game has resumed with a new, watchful quality that suggests everyone involved has recalibrated their trust levels. The evening is deepening. Outside, the light has gone from grey to dark, and the town's curfew bell is probably somewhere in the near future. Medieval towns had curfew regulations: couvre, few, translation, cover your fire, a requirement to bank the household fire and retire indoors for the night, to reduce fire risk, and keep the streets clear of the people most likely to cause trouble after dark. In practice, the curfew applied more to outdoor movement and public fires than to tavern operation, and many taverns were allowed to continue serving until a later hour. But there was a point each evening when the official position of the town was that people should be heading home. A few of the patrons are already preparing to do this, finishing their ale, settling with the alewife, pulling cloaks back on in the way of people facing a cold walk home in the dark. Let's talk about paying, because it is not as simple as settling a tab. Most tavern transactions in the medieval period operated on a combination of cash and informal credit. Coins existed in a range of denominations, and the exact coins you'd hand over depended on where you were in Europe and which century. But many regular patrons operated on a running tab, a chalk mark or notch kept by the alewife that was settled periodically. The phrase, "mind your P's and QS," or at least one of the theories about its origin, refers to the pints and quarts a drinker owed marked on a board behind the counter. To mind them was to keep track of your own consumption so you weren't surprised at reckoning time. This was practical advice, given that the primary activity of the evening had been drinking something with mind. Altering properties and memory is not always reliable under those conditions. Travellers like yourself usually paid cash, because you had no established tab and no social relationship with the alewife that would sustain credit. The price of ale was, in many parts of medieval Europe, regulated by law. The assize of ale, established in England in 1266, was a royal regulation that set the price of ale based on the current cost of grain. This sounds like a very sensible piece of consumer protection, until you realise it was also deeply problematic to enforce, that alewives routinely charged above regulated prices, or reduced the quantity served, and that the standard punishment for repeated violations was a fine, or in some towns, a ducking on the cucking stool, a device designed to publicly humiliate offenders by dunking them in water. Alewives were the most frequently prosecuted group under the assize of ale, which tells you either that they were the most egregious violators, or that they were the most visible target for enforcement of a law that was fundamentally unworkable in practice. Possibly both. If you are staying the night, which you probably are, because riding out of a medieval town after dark is an exercise in very committed self-harm, you need to arrange lodging. In larger taverns and inns, this might mean a proper sleeping room, which is optimistic language for a room containing several beds, each of which is occupied by multiple people who did not arrive together. Privacy in the medieval tavern overnight is not a concept that has been budgeted for. The beds are shared because beds were expensive, space was limited, and the expectation that you would share sleeping space with strangers was so thoroughly normalized that not sharing was the unusual state requiring explanation. The bed, if the establishment is well appointed, is a wooden frame with a rope lattice base, a straw-filled mattress, and a linen sheet that has been washed at some point in the recent past. If the establishment is less well appointed, the rope lattice is looser, the mattress is older, and the linen sheet is doing its best given the circumstances. The blanket on top is wool, scratchy and heavy, and it smells like everyone who has slept under it before you, which is a lot of people, because it has been laundered with rather less frequency than the sheet. You don't know this with certainty, you suspect it with high confidence. The man who was arguing about dice is in the bed to your left. He is asleep already, the ale having done its work, and he is snoring with the tranquil consistency of someone who has never experienced an uncomfortable conscience. On your right is a travelling merchant from 3 towns east, who introduced himself during the brief phase when everyone getting into bed exchanged names and destinations in the exhausted social ritual of shared sleeping, and who is now reading something by the light of a small candle in a way that suggests he intends to be awake for some time. Above you, the thatched roof of the tavern shifts and settles in the wind, and from somewhere in it you can hear the specific scratching movement of things with more legs than you currently want to think about. The rushes on the floor are moving slightly near the wall. There are definitely rats. There are also, somewhat more intimately, fleas. Fleas in a medieval inn were as reliable as the ale. More reliable, actually, because the ale could run out. Fleas did not run out. They inhabited the straw mattresses, the wool blankets, the rushes on the floor, and the bodies of every person and animal in the vicinity, with a thoroughness that suggests evolutionary satisfaction with the arrangement. You feel the first bite within 10 minutes of lying down, then another, then several at once, a coordinated operation that makes you understand why scratching your arms in public was not considered unusual behaviour in the medieval period. The merchant to your right makes a small resigned sound and adjusts his position. He has been here before. He has a philosophy about the fleas. You can see it in his face. the expression of a man who has made his peace with an unavoidable fact of life and merely waits for sleep to overtake the discomfort. There are also bedbugs, though these are even more invisible than the fleas and will announce themselves only in the morning as a collection of geometric bites, arranged with the horrible regularity of something that was feeding with patience and method. Medieval people knew about bedbugs. They had various remedies. They stuffed bed frames with herbs known to repel insects, applied various tinctures to the wood, and occasionally burned sulphur in a room to fumigate it. None of these methods worked reliably, which is why bedbugs remained a constant feature of communal sleeping until the 20th century, when chemistry finally gave humanity a tool adequate to the problem. For now, in the 14th century, you lie in the dark and make peace with the ecosystem. Sleep comes eventually. It comes in segments, which was, historians now tell us, actually the normal pattern for pre-industrial sleep. The concept of 8 hours of solid unconscious rest is a product of artificial lighting and the industrial schedule. Before electric light made it possible to push activity deep into the night, humans commonly slept in 2 periods. A first sleep from roughly dark until midnight or so, a waking period of an hour or 2 during which people engaged in quiet activity, prayer or conversation, and then a second sleep until dawn. The tavern accommodates this naturally. Around midnight the room is quiet and then not quiet. The merchant sits up and writes something by candlelight. Someone in the far bed coughs and shifts. Conversation occurs, low and brief, between 2 people you can't see. And then silence reasserts itself, and the second sleep comes, and the night moves through to grey. The morning in a medieval tavern arrives without ceremony, meaning without an alarm, without a clock, and without anyone particularly invested in your comfort. What wakes you is light coming through the cracks in the shutters, the sound of the street outside beginning its day, which includes animals, carts, voices, and the particular sound of a town waking up in an era before noise regulations, and the smell of the morning tavern, which is different from the evening tavern in a way that is technically better and practically still quite robust. The fire has been rebuilt. Something is being heated in the kitchen. Your body is reporting its inventory from the night, stiffness, dehydration, the constellation of insect bites that has appeared on your forearms and neck, and the specific morning after ale sensation that is not quite a hangover in the modern sense, because the ale was not strong enough for that, but is a mild fogginess and thirst that says your body is aware ale happened and has opinions about the quantity. The other people in the sleeping room are in various stages of consciousness. The dice argument man is already up and gone, leaving a dent in the straw that still holds the shape of his shoulders. The merchant is sitting on the edge of the bed, replacing items in his pack, with the methodical focus of a man who is already planning the road ahead. 2 others are still horizontal, one visibly reluctant to convert from sleeping to waking. A state of affairs that is entirely human and entirely relatable across all centuries. Breakfast in the tavern, if it is offered at all, is minimal. The concept of breakfast as an important meal is itself somewhat variable in the medieval period. Many working people ate their main meal midday and made do with bread and ale in the morning. The tavern offers what it has, which is yesterday's bread, this morning's ale, and possibly some porridge if the kitchen is feeling ambitious. You eat the bread and drink the ale, which is thinner than last night's, and considerably less appealing in the grey morning light, but which does the job of putting something in you before the road. You settle your account with the alewife, who has been awake since before you and shows no signs of the previous evening's labours except perhaps a slight tightening around the eyes. The sum is in small coins, a few pennies for the ale, a few more for the supper, a small additional amount for the sleeping space. By modern standards, it is nothing. In medieval terms, it represents perhaps a quarter of a labourer's daily wage, which means it is something, a real cost that people calculated against their resources. Travellers, merchants, and the middle ranks of society could absorb it. The genuinely poor did not use the tavern as lodging because they could not afford it, sleeping instead in outbuildings, stables, undercovered market stalls, or in the houses of whatever charitable strangers their situation could secure. You collect your horse from the stable at the back of the building, which has its own smell, and prepare to leave. For a moment you stand in the doorway between the tavern and the street and take in the morning. The town is fully awake now, the street moving with the usual traffic of a medieval working day. Women carrying water from the well. A cart loaded with wood for the baker's oven. A group of apprentices walking in the slightly resigned formation of people, going somewhere they have to be. The tavern behind you is already preparing for another day. The alewife is sweeping out the old rushes which are replaced on a schedule that is optimistic. rather than frequent. Someone is carrying a fresh barrel into the cellar. The ale stake is still in place over the door, confirming that last night's supply has been replenished, and the business of drinking can resume whenever the first customer arrives, which, based on the group of labourers approaching from the east end of the street, will be shortly. This is the rhythm of the medieval tavern, not spectacular, not dramatic in the way of movies or textbooks, just continuous. Day after day, year after year, century after century, the same basic transaction. You arrive tired, cold, and thirsty. The ale is poured, the fire burns. The noise rises through the evening and subsides toward midnight. You sleep in the presence of strangers and their fleas. You wake to bread and thin ale. You leave and the next traveller comes in. The building around this ritual may be better or worse. The ale more or less fresh, the food more or less adequate, the company more or less trustworthy. But the ritual itself is essentially unchanged from the Roman mansio to the Tudor coaching inn to the Victorian pub to whatever establishment is currently dispensing drinks near you. Let's go back inside for a moment, because we haven't talked about everyone in that tavern, and there are people in the corner we've been politely ignoring who deserve their moment. The women specifically, not the alewife who we've met, but the other women in the room, because there are some, and their presence is more complicated than Hollywood generally suggests. Women in medieval taverns occupied an ambiguous social position. Women of good reputation, meaning women who were married, respectable, and associated with a stable household, were not supposed to be in taverns unaccompanied. The tavern was coded as male space, in ways that were never entirely formal, but were deeply real. A respectable woman might enter a tavern to purchase ale to take home, or to conduct business with the landlord if her husband was occupied, or in the company of her husband, or male relatives. She was not supposed to sit alone at a table and drink. The moral literature of the medieval period was very clear on this, though moral literature was, as always, more descriptive of what people were doing than what they should have been doing, and the frequency with which it warns women against tavern. Going tells us that women were going to taverns with enough regularity to require extensive warning. Women who worked in taverns occupied a different category. Barmaids, serving girls, and the female family members who worked alongside the alewife were present in tavern spaces by professional necessity. Their social status as a result was complicated, proximate to the rough male world of drinking. They were subject to assumptions and behaviours that they were not in a position to simply refuse. The historical record here is fragmentary and indirect, but the legal records of medieval towns include enough cases of harassment, assault, and worse involving tavern workers to make clear that working in a tavern was not without specific and serious hazards. The alewife herself, as an independent operator, had more authority and more ability to set the terms of the space she controlled. A serving girl had considerably less. There is also the category of women in taverns who were there for reasons the period described, with varying degrees of condemnation and hypocrisy as disreputable. Sex work in medieval Europe was a real and extensively documented practice that existed in complex relationship with tavern culture. Some establishments were explicitly brothels, others were taverns with arrangements on the side. Others were perfectly respectable establishments that nonetheless attracted individuals seeking various things, because any space with a degree of social loosening and a ready supply of people who were away from home was going to serve that market to some extent. The line between tavern and brothel was not always clear in the medieval period, and the municipal efforts to control, regulate, license, or suppress sex work often ran directly through tavern regulation in ways that complicate any simple reading of what a particular establishment actually was. Let's step back and think about what the tavern meant in the medieval social order, because it is actually more interesting than the sum of its components. Medieval society was organised around hierarchies: the church, the nobility, the merchant class, the artisans, the labourers, the rural poor. These hierarchies were mostly rigid. You were born into a place in the social order, and it was extremely difficult to move from it. The tavern was one of the few spaces where this hierarchy became temporarily permeable. Not erased, never erased. The merchant and the labourer still knew their relative positions, but the tavern put them in the same room, drinking the same drink, eating the same food, subject to the same rules of the house. The priest shared air and noise with the dice player. The travelling nobleman, if he was in a smaller establishment, and not the sort of place that catered exclusively to his class, might find himself at a table near men he would normally not acknowledge on the street. The shared space and the shared ale created something that wasn't equality, but was a kind of temporary social adjacency that was rare in medieval life. The church understood this and found it deeply suspicious. The tavern was a place where social barriers dissolved, where hierarchy became porous, where the careful distinctions that kept medieval society organized started to blur at the edges. Men said things in taverns they wouldn't say in church or in court. Information moved through taverns that official channels would have suppressed. Seditious thoughts, heretical ideas, complaints about taxation, rumours about the king's personal life. All of these circulated through the tavern network in a way that was very difficult to monitor or control. Medieval kings and lords periodically attempted to crack down on tavern culture precisely because they recognized it as a space outside their immediate authority. These attempts were never particularly successful, because you cannot, in the end, prohibit the human need for warmth, ale, and company. The noise level in the tavern has peaked and begun its slow evening descent. The labourers left an hour ago. Their departures staggered across a half hour as the group dissolved one by one. The man with the longest walked home, leaving first. The merchants are still there, but quieter now. The transaction of the day apparently concluded, their conversation having moved from business to the slower register of men, sitting with drinks purely for the pleasure of sitting. The singing has stopped, or rather it has paused, because the singer has fallen asleep, sitting up with his chin on his chest, in the posture of a man in a negotiation between consciousness and unconsciousness. That consciousness is clearly losing. The priest is still there. He has been there for the entire evening. He will presumably leave at some point before matins, if he has matins, which, given the quantity of ale consumed tonight, seems like an optimistic scheduling assumption. The fire has burned lower, and nobody has added wood in the last half hour, which means the room is cooler, and the smoke has thinned slightly, which is actually an improvement on the earlier atmosphere. The tallow candles are burning down. The smell of burnt tallow, a slightly rancid, animal fat smell, that medieval people found unremarkable, because it was the smell of every interior after dark, mixes with the wood smoke, and the ale, and the accumulated human presence, into the specific olfactory signature of a tavern evening in its later stages. If you could bottle it, nobody would buy it. But if you had grown up in the 14th century, it would smell like the end of the day, like rest, like the short space between one hard day and the next. The alewife is wiping down the counter with a cloth of uncertain history. She does this with the automatic efficiency of someone doing something for the 1000th time, her eyes moving around the room in the periodic scan of a person who is always counting. How many customers? How much drunk? What is the mood? Who is about to cause a problem? What does she need to do to close down smoothly tonight? She has done this every night for years. She will do it tomorrow night, and the night after that. Her operation here is not glamorous, and it is not, by the standards of her society, a high-status occupation. Alewives were regularly prosecuted under the assize of ale, regularly fined for short measures or excessive pricing, regularly subject to moral commentary about the character of women who ran drinking establishments. And yet, she is an independent economic operator in a period in society where female economic independence was rare. She controls her own income, manages her own accounts, makes her own decisions about purchasing, brewing, staffing, and pricing. The tavern is hers. That is not nothing. In the 14th century, that is actually quite a lot. There are approximately 70,000 licensed drinking establishments in England in the late 14th century. That is one for every 43 people in the entire population. That is not a bar on every corner. That is a bar between every 2 corners, with a bar on the corner as well. This is more drinking establishments per capita than England has today. The tavern, the alehouse, the inn, taken together, were the most numerous commercial establishments in medieval Europe, exceeding bakers, butchers, smiths, and virtually every other trade, which tells you something about what medieval people prioritized, or rather, what medieval life required. In a world without heating systems, without cafes, without community centres, without most of the non-domestic spaces we take for granted, the tavern filled a void that was not optional. It was the warm room, the information hub, the employment exchange, the courthouse, adjacent space where witnesses swore oaths, deals were concluded, and debts were acknowledged. The church argued that the tavern was the devil's chapel. The ordinary people of medieval Europe responded by building one on every street and spending their evenings in it, which tells you something about whose theology was winning that particular argument in practice. Think about what it meant to be a traveller in this world, specifically you, tonight, in this tavern, 3 days on the road from wherever you came from. The road was either a Roman remnant, still reasonably straight and paved, or a local track of varying quality that had been in approximately the same place since people started walking between these 2 points, and nature had done the rest. There were no road signs in any modern sense. There were milestone stones on Roman roads, there were crosses at intersections, there were shrines and distinctive trees used as landmarks. But navigation was largely a matter of prior knowledge, local inquiry, and the ability to ask directions from people who gave them in reference to features you could not see. You arrived at this town after asking no fewer than 4 people the directions, and being told, by 3 of them, to go past the elm tree and then down, which was technically correct, but did not account for the 3 different elm trees, or the ambiguity of down in a landscape that had multiple downward options. The tavern gave you what no other institution on the road could: warmth, food, liquid, information, and sleep, all in one location, without requiring you to know anyone in town, without requiring a letter of introduction, and without requiring anything from you except a few coins and a reasonable disposition toward other people. The inn and tavern system of medieval Europe was the infrastructure of travel. Without it, long-distance movement by ordinary people would have been functionally impossible. With it, you could cross a country knowing that every 20 miles or so, at every town and crossroads settlement of any size, there was a place that would take you in, feed you, and send you on your way in the morning. It was not comfortable, it was not private, it was not safe from fleas or from the man who argued about dice or from the ale that varied wildly in quality from one establishment to the next. But it was there. Night after night, century after century, the ale stake was hung over the door, and the fire was lit, and the door was open. And that, in the medieval world, was enough. There is one more thing to talk about before we put out the candles on this evening. The political life of the tavern, because the medieval tavern was not merely social infrastructure. It was, in ways that made authorities deeply uncomfortable, a space where political thinking happened, where resistance was articulated, and where the relationship between ordinary people and power was negotiated in ways that left no written record, but absolutely left records in behaviour. The great peasant rebellions of the medieval period, the English peasants' revolt of 1381, the French Jacquerie of 1358, the various German uprisings of the 14th and 15th centuries, did not spring fully formed from individual minds working in isolation. They emerged from the cumulative conversations of working people who gathered in alehouses and taverns and talked. The ale was a social lubricant. The shared space was a context in which people could voice, to people who understood their situation, the things they could not say in the hearing of their lord or their employer or the local tax collector. The tavern did not cause the peasants' revolt, but if you follow the evidence backward from the summer of 1381, you find tavern conversations at almost every node of the network that made that revolt possible. John Ball, the radical priest whose letters calling for peasant uprisings circulated in the months before the revolt, was reportedly active in precisely the kinds of informal gatherings in alehouses and churchyards, where people outside official channels communicated. When the rebels gathered and marched, they had already been talking for a long time in the places where talking happened, which was very often. Here, the king's men knew this, municipal authorities knew this, the church knew this. This is why, alongside all the moral concerns about drinking and idleness, and gambling and disreputable company, the authorities had a deeper anxiety about the tavern. It was a space outside their sight. They could not hear what was being said. They could not easily control it. Informers existed then as now, but an informer in a small-town alehouse was quickly identified and quickly excluded. The relative privacy of speech in a loud, smoky room, full of people drinking, was a kind of freedom that was extremely rare in medieval life. You couldn't say what you thought in church. You couldn't say what you thought in the Lord's Court or the market square or the street outside the tax collector's office. You could say it here in a low voice, to the man next to you, and the noise of the room, and the ale in everyone's cups, and the absence of anyone with authority. To enforce consequences gave your words a freedom they had nowhere else. This freedom was real, and it was limited, and it was constantly under threat, and it was absolutely used. The English word gossip derives from godsib, godparent, a term for the network of trusted social relationships that gathered around baptisms and other intimate life events, where people talked freely because they trusted the companies. By the late medieval period, gossip had come to mean the kind of talk that happened in informal, trusted, semi-private social spaces, of which the alehouse was the primary secular example. The gossip of the medieval alehouse was information, politics, resistance, comfort, complaint, and communion, all mixed together and exchanged over cheap ale in a room that smelled like it was trying its best. The night is fully settled now, and the tavern has reached its late evening equilibrium, fire lower, candles guttered, the last remaining drinkers in the slow, quiet phase of an evening's end. The merchant has long since finished his writing and packed his things for morning. The priest has finally gone, slipping out with the sideways movement of a man who has not been here at all. You understand, just passing through. Nothing to record. The alewife is counting the day's earnings by the light of the last candle, her expression unreadable, the coins moving between her fingers with the practiced speed of someone who has done this every night for years. What she is calculating, beyond the raw numbers you can't know, whether tonight was a good night or a disappointing one, whether the barrel that ran low will be replaced in time for tomorrow, whether the man who owes her from last week will come in and pay or continue not coming in. The accounts of a medieval tavern were held largely in the memory of the person running it, supplemented by chalk marks and notches, and the particular human capacity for remembering who owes what when money is involved. Outside, the town is dark and quiet, except for the sound of a dog somewhere, and the distant shift of horses in a stable, and whatever is moving in the street that is probably a cat, and is possibly something else. And either way you are inside, and the door is barred, and that is what matters. The rush candle near the door has burned down to nothing. The fire in the hearth is banked low, enough to hold heat through the night, not enough to read by. The room is dark and warm and filled with the sound of sleeping people in the particular register of a sleep that is deep and unglamorous, and earned by people who have worked hard, and will work hard again tomorrow. You are one of them. In this moment, in this tavern, in this century, you are unremarkable, just another traveller who came in tired and is leaving tomorrow. Your presence in this room will not be recorded anywhere. No one is writing down your name. The alewife's chalk marks will be wiped away when the account is settled. The rushes you slept on will be swept out eventually and replaced. You will be forgotten here as completely as if you never came, which is true of almost everyone who ever sat in this room on any of the evenings it has existed, and will continue to exist long after you have gone. And somehow that is not a sad thought. It is simply an honest one. The medieval tavern was built for exactly this, the temporary comfort of people in motion, people between places, people at the end of hard days, people who needed warmth and ale and the sound of other people before they could sleep. It did not need to remember you to serve you. It served everyone the same, badly lit, flea-ridden, smoke-filled, loud, genuine, open. The steak over the door when the ale was fresh, the fire when you needed it, the alewife who sized you up in 3 seconds and handed you a cup without drama. Let's go back a few hours and talk about something we've been taking for granted. Where does the ale actually come from? Because the barrel behind the counter didn't arrive by magic, and the process by which grain became ale is one of the most interesting and least glamorous domestic technologies in the medieval world. Understanding it changes how you look at the cup in your hand, and not necessarily in a direction that improves the drinking experience. But it is absolutely worth knowing. The alewife brewed the ale herself, usually in the back room or in a separate outbuilding. Brewing was a domestic skill passed from mother to daughter, neighbour to neighbour, across generations and across the entire geography of medieval Europe. The basic process was this. You took grain, most often barley, sometimes oats or a mixture of whatever was available, and you malted it. Malting meant soaking the grain in water until it began to germinate, activating the enzymes that would later convert starches into fermentable sugars, and then drying it to stop the germination at the right point. The drying was done over a fire, and the degree of heat applied during drying affected the colour and flavour of the eventual ale. Low and gentle heat produced pale malt and light ale. Higher heat or longer drying produced darker malt and darker ale. Very high heat produced something that modern brewers would recognise as roasted malt, dark and slightly bitter, but which in the medieval period was often an accident more than an intention. Once you had your malt, you mashed it. This meant grinding the malt into a coarse grain and then steeping it in hot water in a large wooden vessel called a mash tun. The hot water activated those enzymes, and over the course of an hour or two, the starches in the malt converted into sugars. The result was a sweet liquid called wort. You then drained the wort from the grain, which was called lautering, and added it to another vessel, the kettle or copper, where it was boiled. The boiling killed bacteria, concentrated the sugars, and was the point at which flavouring agents were added. In ale, before hops, this was gruit. Gruit is one of the most interesting and underappreciated ingredients in medieval food history. A proprietary mixture of herbs used to flavour and preserve unhopped ale. Gruit typically included bog myrtle, yarrow, wild rosemary, and often a range of other herbs that varied by region, brewer, and century. Some of these herbs were primarily for flavour, Some were preservatives. Some were, and this is where the church's concerns about the tavern start to make a different kind of sense, mildly psychoactive. Yarrow was a known mild narcotic. Wild rosemary, which is not the same plant as culinary rosemary, contains compounds that can produce a mild intoxicating effect in sufficient quantities. Henbane, which appears in some historical brewing records, is a powerful narcotic that in sufficient doses is also a poison. The cumulative effect of a well-made Groot ale, with several of these herbs working together alongside the alcohol, was a drink that produced a somewhat different kind of intoxication than modern beer. Warmer, dreamier, more specifically head, altering rather than simply intoxicating. The Germans had a word for this quality, Rausch, a kind of heady, enveloping altered state. Medieval people knew their ale did something beyond alcohol. They didn't necessarily theorize about it in neurological terms, but they knew it, and they brewed accordingly. The hop, when it arrived in the 14th and 15th centuries, spreading from continental Europe into England, changed all of this. Hops were a better preservative than Groot, and produced a cleaner, more consistent beverage. The hoppy bitterness we associate with beer was not present in medieval ale, but hops also displaced the more complex psychoactive herb mixtures, producing a simpler, more alcohol-forward drink. The transition from ale to hopped beer was not universally welcomed. English ale drinkers famously resisted hops for generations, with official and unofficial commentary about foreign innovations and the integrity of traditional ale. The fact that traditional ale had certain qualities that hopped beer did not have, and that these qualities were part of why people preferred it, was not explicitly stated in the surviving records, but is legible in the resistance if you look for it. After boiling, the wort was cooled and yeast was added. Medieval brewing used yeast without quite understanding what yeast was. The yeast came from the previous batch's fermentation vessel, from the air itself, from the brewer's hands, from whatever organisms were present in the wooden vessels that had absorbed decades of brewing activity. You didn't add measured quantities of commercial yeast. You added the balm, the foamy head from the previous fermentation, or you relied on the wild yeasts present in your environment to do the work. The result was highly variable. Some batches were excellent, others were sour or flat or developed off, flavours that spoke to a contamination nobody had the tools to diagnose. This variability was normal and accepted. The assize of ale's quality requirements were based on whether a batch was drinkable, not on whether it was excellent. Drinkable was the standard. Excellent was a bonus. Fermentation took anywhere from a few days to a week or more, depending on temperature, yeast health, and the specific character of the batch. In summer, the warm temperatures accelerated fermentation, but also accelerated spoilage. Summer ale was consumed quickly because it didn't keep. In winter, the cold slowed fermentation and also slowed spoilage, meaning winter ale kept longer but took longer to condition. The ale you are drinking tonight, the cloudy, thick, slightly yeasty cup the alewife handed you, is probably a day or two off peak fermentation. It is still slightly actively fermenting, which accounts for the cloudiness. It will be better tomorrow actually, when it is a little more settled, but tomorrow someone else will be drinking it and tonight it is yours, and it is warm, and you are tired, and none of this matters very much. Now let's talk about what happened to Groot specifically, because the story is actually about power and money rather than flavour, which makes it considerably more interesting. Groot, in much of northern Europe, was not something you could make yourself freely. The right to produce and sell Groot was, in many areas, a monopoly held by the church, specifically by certain bishops and abbots, or by secular lords who had been granted the Groot right by a higher authority. To brew ale legally in these areas, you had to purchase your Groot from the holder of the Groot right. This was, by the standards of any century, an excellent business. Everyone needed to brew. You could charge whatever the market sustained. The church and the local lords grew wealthy on Groot income in ways that created a direct economic incentive to maintain the ale brewing tradition and specifically to resist the introduction of hops. When hops arrived and started replacing Groot, the holders of Groot rights watched their income evaporate. The church's opposition to hopped ale in the 15th century was, unsurprisingly, partly theological. Some interesting arguments were made about the moral qualities of the respective beverages, but it was also very straightforwardly economic. The Cologne Brewery Statute of 1381 banned hops. Various German cities followed. English authorities were suspicious of hops for over a century. The official position was about quality and tradition. The underlying position was about money. and who was going to lose it when people switched to a preservative they could grow in their own garden instead of purchasing from the local bishop. The ale won, eventually. By the 17th century, hops had entirely displaced Grut across most of northwestern Europe. The word beer was used for the hopped product. Ale still sometimes meant unhopped, though this distinction gradually faded, and the Grut industry was gone. The church kept the tavern, metaphorically speaking. It just had to find other reasons to disapprove of it. You've been here long enough now to start recognizing the regulars. Not just the characters in the room tonight, but the patterns of who uses a tavern like this, and why. The categories are fairly consistent across the medieval world, varying in detail, but consistent in structure. You have the labourers and craftsmen who come here after work, most of them men from the immediate neighbourhood, their faces familiar to the alewife, and to each other their drinking habits predictable, their credit reliable, because the social cost of not paying a local alewife is visible to everyone they know. You have the travellers, which includes you, people who are passing through and have no other option, whose reliability is unknown, and whose accounts must therefore be settled before they leave. You have the merchants, who are a category between those two, often regulars in the sense of passing through on a known circuit, but not local, their faces known to the alewife from previous visits. If the circuit is regular enough, their credit somewhere between local and stranger. And then there are the others, the men who are here every day, morning to closing, whose lives have been organised around the tavern in a way that the moral commentators of the period found alarming, and the legal system found inconvenient. Medieval authorities used the term ostiarius, roughly meaning a habitual tavern, sitter for men who spent most of their waking hours in alehouses rather than working. The penalties for this in various jurisdictions ranged from fines to forced labour to expulsion from the town. The existence of such laws tells you that the habitual tavern sitter was common enough to require legislative attention, which is both obvious in retrospect and slightly poignant when you think about what it means. Men who had, for whatever reason, no work to go to, no household to maintain, no other place to be, and who chose the warmth and company and continuous availability of the alehouse over the alternative, which was being cold and alone outside. The church had names for the sins associated with tavern, going, and they were thorough about cataloguing them. Gluttony, obviously, for the overindulgence in food and drink. Lust, for the various things that happened or were rumoured to happen in taverns after dark. Sloth, for the idle time, spent in an alehouse when labour was theoretically possible. Wrath, for the violence. And pride, somewhat more abstractly, for the social levelling that allowed men of low station to behave with an ease and confidence that was improper given their position. 5 of the 7 deadly sins comfortably accessible under one roof. The 6th and 7th, avarice and envy, were covered by the gambling. The church had identified the tavern as something like a one-stop spiritual disaster zone. The people coming through the door every evening seemed to view this risk as entirely acceptable, given the warmth and the ale. Let's talk about Chaucer, because we should, because he gave us the single most vivid and detailed account of a medieval English tavern that we have, and because it happens at the beginning of one of the greatest works of medieval literature, and because it is entirely possible that he would find it amusing to be brought up in a video about medieval taverns at an unspecified hour of the night. The Canterbury Tales, written in the 1380s and 1390s, opens at the Tabard Inn in Southwark, just outside London. The narrator, who is a version of Chaucer himself, arrives at the inn and finds a group of pilgrims assembled there, about to set out for Canterbury. He joins them. The proprietor of the Tabard, a man named Harry Bailey, proposes the storytelling contest that structures the entire work, and the whole enterprise begins in the tavern, at a table, over food and drink, in the way that almost everything interesting in the medieval world began. The Tabard was a real inn. It stood in Borough High Street in Southwark, until it was destroyed by fire in 1676. What Chaucer describes is recognisable as the kind of place we've been talking about tonight. A place that serves travellers, provides beds, offers food and drink, and creates the social conditions under which people of different ranks and backgrounds find themselves in temporary community with each other. The pilgrims Chaucer assembles are a cross-section of English society, a knight, a miller, a pardoner, a wife from Bath, who has outlived 5 husbands, a cook whose shin has an ulcer that Chaucer describes in clinical detail for reasons that are either comic or deeply committed to realism, or both. They would not, in most contexts, share a table or a journey. The inn makes it happen. The road makes it necessary. The ale probably helps. What Chaucer captures about the tavern, something the moralising literature almost always misses is its fundamental sociability. People in these spaces are interesting. They have stories. The enforced proximity of the inn and the road strips away some of the usual social performance. Not all of it. The knight is still very much a knight, and the miller is still very much a miller. But enough that actual humanity becomes visible. The wife of Bath is honest about her own experience, and desires in a way that a woman of her time couldn't be in most other contexts. The partner admits to selling fake relics, essentially confessing to fraud, in a setting where this confession has a kind of dark safety, because everyone listening is also implicated in the world of imperfect, compromised, morally untidy human life. The tavern and inn do this. They create the conditions for a certain kind of honesty. Not always, not in every case, but often enough to matter. The tavern in different seasons is a different creature, and if you've only visited one evening in an indeterminate autumn, you've missed the full range. In winter, the tavern becomes something close to essential in ways that the summer version only approximates. When you are cold in summer, you are uncomfortable. When you are cold in a medieval winter, you may be genuinely in danger. Hypothermia was a real and not uncommon cause of death in pre-industrial Europe, particularly for the old, the very young, and the poor whose housing was inadequate against serious cold. The tavern with its fire was, for some people on some nights, the difference between surviving the night and not. People who had no functioning hearth at home, travellers caught by weather, the genuinely destitute who could scrape together the price of an ale and thereby secure several hours in a warm room. The winter tavern served a survival function that its summer counterpart did not need to. In summer, the tavern opens out. The door stands wide. People spill into whatever outdoor space exists. A yard if the establishment has one, the street outside if it doesn't. Drinking in the open air was normal and common in warm months. Temporary trestle tables set up outside. The ale stake visible at a distance. The sound of a tavern carrying into the summer evening. The summer tavern was livelier and louder and less contained, with its noise and its custom spreading into the surrounding streets, in ways that neighbours found alternately convivial and deeply irritating, depending on how close they were and how much they'd had to drink themselves. The complaints about tavern noise in medieval court records are almost entirely summer complaints. In winter, everyone was too cold and too focused on the fire to be a nuisance to anyone more than a few feet away. In the winter tavern, you are closer to the fire, not by choice but by architecture. The central hearth or the fireplace along one wall is the only heat source, and the room's entire social geometry arranges itself around it. The people nearest the fire are the people who got there first, or who paid for the privilege, or who have the social authority to claim it. The further you are from the fire, the colder you are, and the colder you are, the more the ale becomes a warming mechanism rather than a pleasurable beverage. You drink more and you drink faster. The alewife understands this, and her stock levels in winter reflect it. The winter tavern goes through considerably more ale per customer than the summer version, which is both a business advantage and a social complexity, because drunk and cold is a combination that has specific behavioural patterns, mostly in the direction of fights and accidents. The seasonal rhythm also affected the available food. Summer brought fresh vegetables and herbs, garden produce that could supplement or replace the dried staples. Autumn was the season of the harvest feast, when the pottage was at its most varied and substantial, when there might be fresh meat because animals were slaughtered before winter rather than fed through it. Winter reduced everything to salt, smoke, and dried goods. The bread got darker and denser as the fresh grain stores dwindled toward spring. The pottage got thinner. The ale got rationed if the brewing grain had been insufficient. Late winter, the period the medieval peasant called the hungry gap, was when the stores from autumn were running low, and the new harvest was still months away. The late winter tavern had less of everything, and charged more for it. If you have any flexibility about when to make this visit, autumn is when the food is best, and the ale is freshest, and the company is in its best mood about the world. Come back in March and everything will be harder. Let's talk about the animals, because the medieval tavern had animals in it, and this deserves acknowledgement. Horses were stabbed separately, usually in a dedicated outbuilding, but dogs were everywhere in the tavern interior. Working dogs, hunting dogs, dogs that lived with their owners and went where their owners went, which was the tavern. Medieval dogs in public spaces were not the pampered and leashed pets of modern imagination. They were working animals with varying degrees of training and social education, and they circulated through the tavern floor with the unself-conscious confidence of creatures who regarded every space as potentially containing food. The dogs were useful for warmth in cold weather. a large dog pressed against your legs being genuinely effective at raising the local temperature. They were also useful for clearing the floor rushes of food scraps, which was a service the alewife appreciated since it reduced the encouragement given to rats. The line between useful floor, scavenger and nuisance was something each individual dog negotiated on its own terms. Cats were also present in the professional capacity of mouse and rat management. A tavern without a cat was a tavern actively hosting its rodent population without any mitigation strategy. The cat's role was understood, and the cat was fed accordingly, not luxuriously, never luxuriously, but consistently enough to keep it in residence. The medieval cat was not a pet in any emotional sense. It was a contract. You provide mice management, we provide food. Nobody discusses the terms explicitly, but everyone understands them. This is a fairly clean commercial arrangement, and it worked reliably across centuries. Pigs occasionally appeared in spaces that were attached to taverns, because many urban households in the medieval period kept pigs, which foraged on waste and kitchen scraps, and would try to enter any space where food was available with a determination that said swine had not been given sufficient credit for their initiative. There are court records of pigs entering taverns and causing various disturbances. This was not considered as remarkable as it would be today, more of a nuisance than a crisis. Someone would chase the pig out, the pig would return, the pig's owner would eventually be fined. This was the cycle. The children of the alewife worked in the tavern from an early age, because the tavern was the family business, and family businesses in the medieval period did not distinguish between the work sphere and the domestic sphere. A child of 7 or 8 who was the alewife's son or daughter was carrying cups, sweeping rushes, stirring the kitchen fire, helping with the barrel rotation, and absorbing the skills and knowledge of the trade by simple proximity. This was not considered childhood labour in the modern sense of exploitation. It was considered preparation. The child who helped in the tavern from a young age would be equipped to run a tavern themselves, which was a viable livelihood and a form of independent economic operation that was better than many alternatives available to people of their social position. The education was practical, absorbing, and completely without formal structure, and it produced people who could run a complex small business, manage a diverse customer base, maintain accounts in their heads, and hold their own in any social situation the world threw at them. Not bad for an education that happened while you were carrying cups. Now let's talk about wine, because the medieval tavern had wine, at least in some forms, and in some establishments. And wine tells a different story than ale. Wine in the medieval period was primarily an aristocratic and ecclesiastical drink, expensive, imported from the wine-growing regions of France, the Rhineland, Italy, and Iberia, and associated with a status level that ale was not. The wine tavern, as distinct from the alehouse, was a more upmarket establishment, typically found in larger towns, and serving a wealthier clientele. If you were a prosperous merchant, or a knight, or a higher cleric, you went to the wine tavern. If you were a labourer, or an artisan, you went to the alehouse. This wasn't an absolute rule, but it was a very general tendency that reflects the price difference between the two commodities. English ale was cheap because the ingredients grew locally and the labour was domestic. French wine had travelled from the vineyards of Bordeaux on ships across the Channel, then up the river network to wherever you were, with every step adding cost, and every week of travel adding the risk of spoilage. Wine bought in a London tavern in the 14th century was not fresh wine. It had been in transit. The barrel had been moved and bumped and left in various storage conditions of varying quality. The resulting product, at the cheaper end of the market, was frequently oxidized, vinegary, or otherwise compromised. Medieval wine drinkers added honey, spices, and various herbs to their wine, not purely for flavor enhancement, but as a way of making an inferior product more palatable. Hippocras, a spiced wine drink popular in the medieval period, was essentially a recipe for salvaging mediocre wine, with enough cinnamon, ginger, and honey to override whatever the wine was actually tasting like. Good wine, genuinely well-made and well-transported recent vintage, was available in England, but at prices that made it a genuinely special occasion purchase for all but the highest income levels. The king drank excellent wine, the bishop drank very good wine, the prosperous merchant drank wine that was acceptable, the craftsman, if he drank wine at all, drank whatever was cheapest, which was usually whatever was oldest and most questionable. He generally didn't bother and went back to the ale. Mead deserves a mention because it is the oldest alcoholic drink in the European tradition, and it was absolutely present in medieval taverns, though by the high medieval period it had been largely displaced by ale. as the everyday drink of common people. Mead is fermented honey and water, simple in ingredients and complex in execution, because the sugar content of the honey ferments differently from grain sugars and requires careful management of yeast and temperature to produce a clean result, rather than a sour or off-flavoured one. Good mead, properly made and conditioned, was a genuinely excellent drink, complex and fragrant, and it commanded a premium price that reflected the cost of honey, which was expensive before sugar became available and was the primary sweetener in European cooking. Bad mead was a drink that was trying its best under difficult circumstances and asking you not to ask too many questions. Cider occupied a similar position in regions where apples grew abundantly, particularly in the west of England, Normandy, and Brittany. Cider taverns existed in these regions, serving a product that was local, seasonal, and considerably cheaper than wine. The cider of the medieval period was not the light, commercial product familiar today. It was harder, more variable, more distinctly flavoured by the specific apple varieties used, and considerably more alcoholic than most modern ciders because the fermentation was allowed to run further. In a good apple year with good fruit and a skilled cider maker, medieval cider could be a revelation. In a bad year with compromised fruit and impatient fermentation, it was an experience that required commitment and a certain forgiveness for unpleasant surprises. The people of the cider counties drank it anyway because it was theirs. It was cheap, and they had been drinking it since before anyone could remember, which in the medieval understanding of tradition was sufficient reason to continue indefinitely. The sign outside the tavern is something we glanced past when we arrived and ought to go back to, because the signs of medieval drinking establishments are more interesting than they appear. The ale stake or ale bush was functional. It told you fresh ale was available. But many establishments also had actual signs, painted boards or three-dimensional objects hung over the door that identified the specific establishment. In a world without widespread literacy and without numbered addresses, the sign was the address. You didn't say, "I'll meet you at 43 Market Street." You said, "I'll meet you at the sign of the Bull," or the sign of the White Hart, or the sign of the Crossed Keys. The names of medieval taverns, as preserved in records and literature, are a taxonomy of medieval visual symbolism: animals, religious symbols, heraldic devices, objects, and occasional references to specific historical events or local landmarks. The swan was popular. The lamb, with its religious overtones, appeared frequently. The crown was aspirational, suggesting royal favour, whether any such favour existed or not. The cock and bull, source of the phrase cock, and bull story, referred to two specific inns in Stony Stratford, England, where travellers in opposite directions would stop and exchange news and rumours of dubious reliability. The phrase entered the language from the tavern and stayed there. The sign was also a form of advertising before advertising had a theory of itself. A dramatic or distinctive sign attracted the eye of travellers approaching from a distance and distinguished your establishment from the one next door. The pictorial nature of the sign was not purely about illiteracy, though it did serve the illiterate customer. It was also a visual brand in the most literal sense, a unique image that was yours, and that people would recognise and remember. The 3 golden balls above a pawnbroker's, a tradition that persists in some places today, came from the same visual culture of professional and commercial signage that gave medieval taverns their distinctive icons. Walk down a medieval high street, and you are walking through a gallery of visual communication designed by tradespeople who understood, without any formal training in graphic design, that the eye needs something to catch on and the memory needs something specific to return to. Let's slow down and sit with the regulars for a while, because the regular customers of a medieval tavern are one of the most interesting social categories in the period, and they don't get enough attention. The regulars, the people who come here every day or nearly every day, are the tavern's foundation in a way that the occasional traveller is not. They are the guaranteed income, the stable social ecosystem, the audience for the Oliat's performance as tavern keeper. Their relationships with the alewife are complex, ongoing, and subject to all the negotiation of any long-term commercial relationship. Credit extended, and sometimes called in, special treatment earned through loyalty and reliable payment. Tolerance for difficult evenings, because of accumulated goodwill. The implicit mutual understanding that this relationship is ongoing and worth maintaining on both sides. The regulars also provide the tavern's social backbone. In another sense, they are the people who know what happened last week, what happened last year, what happened when the old alewife ran the place before this one. They carry the institutional memory of the establishment and the neighbourhood. New travellers arrive and get a read on the local situation through the regulars, not through official channels, but through the accumulated experience of people who live here and watch everything. The regulars know which road is safe and which has had trouble recently. They know which local official is fair and which one should be avoided. They know whose wall is good and whose is short-weighted. They know everything that moves through this town that is worth knowing, and they are the living information infrastructure of the medieval community. One of the regulars at a typical medieval alehouse would be someone you might call a professional witness. Medieval legal proceedings frequently required witnesses, people who could attest to transactions, agreements, and the circumstances of disputes. The tavern was a common venue for the conclusion of commercial agreements, and the regulars present when such an agreement was made were the natural witnesses. You bought a horse and shook hands on the price in the tavern. The two men sitting at the next table who saw it happen were your witnesses if the deal was ever disputed. This is why legal records of the medieval period so frequently note that a transaction was concluded at the sign of the bull in the parish of wherever. The tavern was, informally, but effectively, a place where business was witnessed, and thereby made legally real. The alewife herself sometimes appears in records as a witness, her presence at the establishment all day every day, making her a reliable and continuously available observer of whatever business was transacted there. The court leet, the local manorial court that handled small-scale civil and criminal matters in English villages and small towns, dealt with tavern-related complaints with regularity. Alewives prosecuted for short measures or excessive prices. Customers fined for disturbing the peace or for fighting. The establishment itself occasionally cited for allowing gambling or for staying open past curfew. These records are dry and formulaic, the same legal language repeated case after case. But read cumulatively, they build a picture of the tavern as a space under continuous low-level negotiation with local authority. The courts wanted the tavern to function within defined limits. The tavern operated as close to the edge of those limits as it could, because that edge was where the money was. The regulars who provided the stable income were also, often enough, the ones generating the complaints that kept the alewife paying fines. This was an arrangement that everyone involved, court, alewife, customers, understood perfectly, and that nobody found it in their interest to fundamentally resolve. The fines were a tax, effectively. The court took its cut. The tavern remained open. The ale kept flowing. The system worked. One more thing that deserves its moment tonight, the church ale. Because here is an irony that medieval life produced with complete straight-facedness, and that deserves to be savoured. The church, which condemned the alehouse, which sent its clergy to preach against the sin of excessive drinking, which prosecuted parishioners for tavern, going on saints' days when they should have been in church, also ran its own ale events with considerable enthusiasm and considerable profit. The church ale, sometimes called a scot. Ale was a fundraising event organised by the parish church, in which ale was brewed specifically for the occasion, sold to the parishioners, and the proceeds used for church expenses, repair of the building, purchase of equipment, general parish funds. These events were held in the churchyard, in the church hall if one existed, or in whatever space was available, and they were, by all surviving accounts, enthusiastically attended. The same people who were in the alehouse on Tuesday night were in the churchyard on the following Sunday afternoon, drinking church, brewed ale, and fundraising for the institution that had been lecturing them about drinking. The church's relationship with alcohol is, in the broadest sense, deeply ambivalent. Wine is sacramental. The Eucharist requires it. The monasteries produced some of the finest wines and ales in Europe, their controlled environments and systematic methods producing consistent quality that commercial producers couldn't match. Monastic brewing was an industry, a source of income, a point of genuine excellence. The brethren of many monasteries drank their own product daily, the allowance varying by rule, but often running to a generous quantity. What the church officially condemned was excess, disorder, the drinking that led to sin. What it actually practiced was a more nuanced relationship with fermented grain and grape that was entirely human and entirely recognizable across any century. The window of light through the oiled parchment has changed. It is later than it was. The town outside has quieted to the specific sound of a medieval night, distant dogs, the occasional voice. The wind in whatever trees are near enough to hear, the creak of timber, frame buildings adjusting to the cooling temperature. Inside, the tavern has reached its final equilibrium. The fire low, the candles reduced to stubs. The last few customers in the slow, reflective phase of an evening that is technically over, but hasn't quite admitted it yet. The merchant from 3 towns east has been replaced by a different merchant from an unspecified distance, who arrived 2 hours ago, and has been eating steadily since, compensating for whatever the road denied him today. The priest is a memory. The dice argument man is a settled grievance that will resurface in the morning, but has no energy left for tonight. The alewife moves through the room with the quiet efficiency of someone wrapping up a performance that has been running continuously for 12 hours. Cups collected, benches pushed back to the walls, the fire banked with the practiced care of someone who knows exactly how much heat to hold through the night without risking the thatch above. She does this without drama because there is no drama left in the evening. Tomorrow it starts again, the fire at dawn, the first customers by mid-morning, the barrel topped up, the bread from the baker down the street, the pottage on the fire by the afternoon. The same structure, the same rhythm, the same faces and the same strangers in their respective categories. Day after day, season after season. The ale stake going up when the new batch was ready and coming down when the barrel ran dry. The bush and the barrel marking time in a way that was slower and more honest than any clock. You think about the road tomorrow, 20 miles, maybe 25, to the next town of any size. You think about the mud if it rained last night, which it may have. You think about the hill 3 miles east that you came down yesterday and will need to climb tomorrow in reverse. You think about the horse who has been stabled and fed and is probably in better condition for tomorrow's journey than you are, which says something about the relative fortunes of horses and travellers in the medieval world. You think about the next tavern 20 miles ahead, and whether the ale will be fresh when you arrive, whether the fire will be going, whether there will be a floor space in the sleeping room that doesn't already have someone in it. And then you stop thinking, because thinking about tomorrow when tonight is still happening is a waste of tonight, and tonight is warm, and the ale has done its work, and the fire is still giving off heat, and the room around you is breathing with the slow breath of people who are tired in the good way. The way that comes from having worked and moved and been alive all day in a world that required a lot from you and received it. You close your eyes for a moment in the particular way of someone who is not yet asleep, but is no longer entirely awake, and the sounds of the tavern settle around you like an old blanket. The fire, the breathing, the shift of the building in the wind, the distant animal life of the street outside. And you are, for this moment, nowhere that requires anything from you. Let's go back to the road for a moment, because the medieval traveller's relationship with the tavern began long before they pushed open the door. Understanding who you are when you arrive here changes what the tavern means to you, and the medieval road produced several distinct categories of traveller, each with a different relationship to the institution you've just spent your evening in. The pilgrim was perhaps the most common long-distance traveller in the medieval period, and pilgrimage was medieval Europe's answer to the question of why anyone would voluntarily walk several hundred miles in difficult conditions wearing uncomfortable footwear. The answers were theological. Visiting a saint's shrine offered spiritual merit, healing, absolution, the fulfillment of a vow, or simply the opportunity to do the most extraordinary thing an ordinary person might do in a lifetime of fixed geography. Santiago de Compostela in northern Spain, Canterbury in England, Rome, Jerusalem. These destinations drew hundreds of thousands of pilgrims annually across the medieval centuries. The roads between them were the veins of a continent, and the taverns along those roads were the chambers of its heart. The pilgrim had a specific relationship with the tavern that was more complicated than the simple travellers. Pilgrimage was, officially, a spiritual exercise, a withdrawal from worldly pleasure in pursuit of divine grace. The conditions of the road, the discomfort, the expense were part of the point. Suffering was theologically useful. A pilgrimage conducted in full comfort, stopping at the best inns, eating well, sleeping soundly, arriving refreshed and cheerful, was spiritually somewhat less impressive than one conducted in genuine hardship. This official position collided constantly with the human reality of people who needed to eat, sleep, and stay warm, and who were, after a day on the road, very interested in a cup of ale and a place to put their feet up. The result was a continuous low-level tension between the spiritual ideal of the pilgrimage and the physical reality of the pilgrim, which Chaucer found hilarious, and which the church found considerably less so. The merchants who travelled the medieval roads were less conflicted about their relationship with the tavern, because they had no spiritual framework requiring them to suffer. Merchants were professional travellers, their livelihoods depending on the movement of goods from place to place, and they had an entirely pragmatic relationship with the inn and tavern network. The good merchants knew which establishments on their circuit were reliable, which alewives could be trusted to extend credit, which taverns had secure storage for valuable goods, which places were known for problematic guests. This knowledge was accumulated over years of travel, and was one of the genuine competitive advantages of experience. The The merchant, who had been travelling the route for 20 years, knew things about the road and its hazards, human and environmental, that no newcomer could access except by making the same discoveries the hard way. The soldier, whether a knight travelling to or from a campaign, or a mercenary between engagements, had a relationship with the tavern that was coloured by the particular social position of men who were trained in violence, and had varying amounts of money at any given time, depending on whether they were currently employed in its application. The military traveller in a good season, just paid from a successful campaign, was the best kind of tavern customer, flush, generous, in a good mood, and creating an atmosphere of expansive spending that raised the whole room. The same man in a bad season, unpaid for months, bitter about outcomes, still carrying weapons that were legal in his hands, and ambiguously legal in everyone else's, was a more complicated presence. The tavern fights that made it into the court records disproportionately involved men with military backgrounds. This is not a moral judgment. It is an observation about the intersection of training, frustration, and alcohol. The travelling clergy were everywhere, and were in some ways the most interesting category, because of the gap between their official status and their actual behaviour. The low clergy, parish priests travelling on church business, itinerant friars, minor clerics pursuing various ecclesiastical errands, had official reasons to be on the road, and no official reason to be in the alehouse, but were there anyway, in numbers that the church hierarchy found tiresome to keep addressing in their moral literature. The higher clergy, bishops and abbots, travelling with retinues, had the resources to stay at establishments more suitable to their station than a common alehouse. And they did, though historical records contain occasional wonderful exceptions. Bishops discovered in circumstances inconsistent with their dignity. Abbots found in establishments that raised canonical questions the whole range of human behaviour present in the official record, as evidence that the official position and the human reality were not always the same thing. The poorest travellers, the ones who had no status and no money and no official reason to be on the road, were the category the tavern could help least. A person with no money could not buy ale. A person with no coin could not pay for sleeping space. The medieval road had people on it who were genuinely destitute, the displaced, the desperate, the victims of local famines or disasters. People looking for work in towns they'd heard had demand. For these travellers the tavern was visible, but unavailable, a warm room through a window that required payment to enter. Some alehouses gave ale to the genuinely poor as an act of charity. Some provided space in the stable to those who could not pay for a bed. The historical record here is thin, because acts of charity were rarely documented in the way that commercial transactions and legal infractions were. But it is hard to imagine, across centuries of human operation, that all alehouses were entirely without mercy for the person who arrived with nothing and needed something. The tavern's relationship with the guild system is worth understanding, because the guilds, the professional associations that regulated craft and trade in medieval towns, used the tavern as a meeting place, a feast venue, and a venue for the social rituals that bound their members together. Guild meetings frequently happened in taverns, the hall of the specific guild being a relatively late development in many trades. The ceremonial meals that marked guild events, admissions of new members, elections of officers, the feast days of the guild's patron saint, happened in the kind of larger tavern or inn that could accommodate a private room and a more ambitious menu than the everyday establishment. These guild events were one of the primary occasions on which the everyday tavern food was supplemented by something more elaborate: roasted meats, pastries, expensive spices, the kinds of food that required the kitchen to take the occasion seriously. The guild feast was a piece of social performance as much as a meal. It displayed the prosperity of the guild, the solidarity of its members, and the seriousness with which they took their professional identity. The food and drink served were calibrated to communicate status: wine rather than ale, multiple courses rather than a single bowl, fresh meat rather than salt. The alewife or innkeeper who hosted these events needed both the physical space and the culinary capacity to meet expectations that were well above the everyday standard of the establishment. The taverns that could do this were the larger and more prosperous ones, usually in the centre of town, with more space, better kitchens, and a reputation for reliability that made guild treasurers comfortable signing the contracts. Let's talk about something that doesn't get enough attention in the romantic retelling of medieval tavern life: the smell of the kitchen. Not the food itself, which we've discussed, but the process of producing it, which was a specific kind of heat, effort, and odour that permeated everything in a medieval cooking operation. The kitchen fire burned continuously when the establishment was open. Over it hung an iron pot, or several pots on adjustable hooks, containing whatever was being simmered. Fat from roasting meat, pig fat primarily, dripped into pans below the roasting spits, and was reused for frying, cooking, and sometimes greasing. The smoke of the fire mixed with the steam of the boiling pots and the smell of the frying fat and the particular scent of herbs being added to flavoured dishes, and the whole combination moved through the entire tavern on the same air currents that carried the warmth from the fire. You don't just eat the food in a medieval tavern, you breathe it for the entire duration of your visit. It is in your hair and your clothes when you leave. This is not a complaint, it is simply accurate. The bread that the tavern buys from the baker down the street was itself subject to the assize of bread, the companion regulation to the assize of ale, that set the price and weight of bread according to the current cost of grain. Like the assize of ale, the assize of bread was routinely violated and routinely enforced, with bakers fined for short-weight loaves, with a frequency that suggests either systematic dishonesty or systematic over-prosecution. The bread available in a tavern was the baker's everyday product, dense, dark, nutritious, and made with the kind of mixed grain flour that produced a loaf capable of surviving the journey from the bakery and several hours on the tavern table without becoming inedible. This was not artisan bread. It was not sourdough. It was sustenance, designed to fill and to last, and it did both reliably. The quality of the pottage in a medieval tavern was the alewife's calling card in a way that the ale was not, because ale quality was partly dependent on ingredients and conditions beyond her control. But pottage quality was entirely a matter of skill, care, and what she chose to put in. A well-made pottage, thick and savoury, and seasoned with the herbs from the garden behind the building, could be genuinely excellent food, hot, nourishing, complex in flavour. Exactly what a body needed after a day of physical work or travel. A poorly made pottage, thin and underseasoned and stretched with water, because the ingredient budget had been tight, was food in the technical sense of the word, and nothing more. Regular customers could tell the difference and discussed it freely, because the quality of the local alewife's pottage was a legitimate topic of community conversation in a world where these were among the few prepared meals most people regularly ate. The spices that appeared in better tavern cooking deserve a moment of specific attention, because they represent one of the most dramatic price disparities in the medieval food system. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. These spices came from Southeast Asia and the Indian subcontinent, travelled overland, and by sea through the Middle East, into the Mediterranean, through the Italian merchant cities, and across the Alps into northern Europe. At every step of this journey, they changed hands and accumulated cost. By the time a pinch of pepper reached a tavern kitchen in inland England, it represented a supply chain spanning 10,000 miles and several years, and its price reflected that journey. Pepper was worth roughly its own weight in silver at various points in the medieval period. Saffron, which only incidentally came from nearby, but was extraordinarily labour-intensive to harvest, was more expensive. Still, the presence or absence of spices in tavern food was therefore a direct economic statement about the establishment. An everyday alehouse put herbs from the garden in the pottage. A better establishment added a pinch of pepper to the meat and some ginger to the special occasion food. A genuinely prosperous tavern serving merchants and wealthy travellers might use multiple spices with something approaching regularity. The spice trade drove much of the medieval European economy and created the merchant class that built the prosperous cities of the period. And all of that global economic activity was visible, in a small way, in whether the pottage had pepper in it. Here is something about the tavern that is easy to miss when you are focused on the ale and the food and the noise. It was a financial institution, not formally, not with ledgers and clerks, but functionally. Money was stored here, debts were recorded here, transactions were concluded here, credit was extended and collected here. The alewife was, in the medieval economic landscape, a small-scale financial operator whose chalk marks and mental accounts represented a layer of the local economy that the official monetary system didn't quite reach. When a labourer needed ale before payday and the alewife extended credit, she was providing a financial service. When a merchant concluded a deal in the tavern with witnesses present, the institution was providing the infrastructure for commercial law. When the court leet fined the alewife for overcharging, and she paid the fine and kept operating, the fine was a kind of licensing fee for continued operation within a regulated framework. The medieval economy was credit-based to a degree that often surprises people who imagine it as a cash, only barter system. Most people at most levels of society operated on some form of credit Most of the time, credit from the miller for grain, credit from the alewife for ale, credit from the baker for bread, seasonal credit against the expected harvest, credit that ran for weeks or months before being settled. The tavern was one node in this web of obligations, and the alewife's chalk marks were as much a part of the financial record of the medieval village as anything written in the manor court accounts. When she wiped the board and marked a debt as paid, she was performing a small act of economic settlement in a system that ran on human trust and social accountability, rather than legal enforcement. Think about what it meant to be the alewife in a medium-sized medieval town. You wait before your customers. You manage the fire. You oversee the kitchen. You manage the accounts, in your head and on your chalkboard. You know what every regular customer has drunk in the past 2 weeks, and what they owe and what their credit limit is, and when they last paid. You handle disputes, which happen daily, with enough authority to resolve them, because you control something everyone in the room wants. You manage the brewing, either yourself or through family labour, understanding the process well enough to know when a batch has gone wrong and what to do about it. You purchase grain, which requires understanding the market and knowing which suppliers are reliable and which ones will short-weight you if you are not watching. You manage staff if you have any, usually family members or young women from the neighbourhood who work for a combination of small wages and lodging and training that might, if they're fortunate, lead to their own establishment someday. She does all of this continuously, 7 days a week, with Sunday restrictions on hours, 12 months a year with brief relief during major religious holidays, when the establishment was technically closed, but probably wasn't entirely. She does it in a body that is also managing pregnancy, childbirth, child rearing, and all the other physical demands of a medieval woman's life. Because the alewife is not a separate category of person from the woman who is also a wife and mother. She is the same person doing all of it simultaneously. The historical record does not linger on how she did this, because the historical record was not written by people who thought it was interesting or noteworthy. We have her name in court records when she was fined. We have her death in parish registers. We have her credit extended and repaid in manorial accounts. What we don't have is her own account of what it cost her. We can only calculate that it cost quite a lot, and that she absorbed the cost, because the alternative was not having an income, and not having a livelihood, and not having the specific independence that running this establishment, however imperfectly and at whatever personal cost, actually gave her. The night watch, in towns that had one, would pass the tavern on its rounds. The watch was a civic institution of variable quality, ranging from genuine law enforcement in the larger and better, organised towns to a somewhat theoretical presence in smaller settlements, where the watchman was a local man with a lantern who may or may not take the job seriously, depending on the weather. The watch's relationship with the tavern was professional and pragmatic. Taverns generated business for the watch in the form of disputes, disturbances, and the occasional person who needed to be removed from the street, in a state that made self-directed locomotion unlikely. The watch knew which establishments had the most active evenings, and visited them more frequently. The alewife knew the watchman by name and kept on terms of professional respect with him, because she needed the watch's cooperation for her own security, and the watch needed the alewife's cooperation for the smooth management of the neighbourhood they both inhabited. It was a business relationship. Both parties understood the terms. If the town was in the middle of a plague year, the tavern situation became dramatically different. The Black Death, which reached Europe in 1347 and killed somewhere between a third and a half of the population in its initial wave, moved through exactly the vectors that tavern culture represented: human proximity, shared surfaces, accumulated population in enclosed spaces. The tavern was, from an epidemiological perspective, a superb disease transmission environment. Dense, warm, poorly ventilated, full of people who had been on the road touching things and then touching their faces. The response of medieval people to plague was not nothing. Quarantine existed. Towns closed their gates, infected households were marked. Movement was restricted. But the tavern was also where you went when you were afraid, when the world outside was dying around you, and you needed the warmth and the ale and the company of people who were still alive. The records from plague years showed taverns continuing to operate even as the population collapsed around them, partly because the alewife needed to make a living, partly because the town still needed the social function the tavern provided, and partly because medieval people understood, without the framework of germ theory, that the choice between dying of plague or dying of despair was not a choice they were willing to make in favour of solitude. The plague also changed the tavern economically in ways that were initially terrible, and then, for survivors, unexpectedly beneficial. When a third of the labour force died, labour became expensive. Workers could demand better wages. Craftsmen could charge more for their work. And ordinary people found themselves, for the first time in many cases, with disposable income beyond bare subsistence. The late 14th century saw a documented increase in ale consumption, in the frequency of tavern visits, in the range and quality of food demanded by working class customers, all of which was driven partly by the economic rebalancing that followed the demographic disaster of the Black Death. The survivors of the plague, brutal as this sounds, often lived better than the people who had died, because there were fewer of them competing for the same resources. The tavern benefited, the alewife's income went up. The ale got slightly better, the food got slightly more ambitious. Humans find ways to continue, and some of the ways involve ale. Let's take one more look around the room before we truly settle in for the night. The fire, the last of the candles. The breathing of people in the sleeping room above. The alewife at her accounting. The sound of the street outside, which is almost silent now, just wind and distant dogs and the small sounds of a town digesting its evening. There is nothing extraordinary about any of this. It has happened every night in this room for however many years this building has stood, and it will happen every night for years to come, and at no point in that long continuity will this particular evening be distinguishable from any other. The names change. The faces change. The specific grievances and conversations and dice arguments change. The structure does not change. The ale, the fire, the company, the sleeping, the morning, the road. Medieval life was, by any modern standard, extremely hard. The work was physical and relentless. The mortality rates were appalling by any comparison. The medicine was ineffective for most serious conditions. The winters were genuinely dangerous without central heating or adequate food stores. The political situation was almost continuously somewhere on the spectrum from uncertain to catastrophic. The church told you that suffering was good for you, and the nobility told you your labour belonged to them, and both of them had the armed force to back their positions. Against all of this, the medieval person had the harvest festival, when for a brief period there was enough. The feast days when work stopped, the church which provided community and ritual, if not always comfort, and the tavern which provided warmth, ale company, and the temporary but genuine relief of being somewhere that was not the field, or the workshop, or the freezing house. These were not small things. Against the accumulated weight of medieval existence, they were very large things indeed. The philosopher Aristotle, whose work the medieval scholars had recovered through Arabic transmission, and made central to European intellectual life, defined the human animal as a social animal, the creature that by nature lives in the polis, the political community. Medieval Europeans didn't need Aristotle to tell them this because they were living it. The tavern was one of the places where being a social animal was both permitted and supported. You could be there with other people. You could speak and be spoken to. You could argue and sing and sit in silence with other people's warmth around you. You could be, in the most fundamental sense, not alone. In a world that was dangerous and uncertain and frequently brutal, not being alone was a form of safety, however minimal. The tavern provided it every evening to everyone who could afford the price of a cup of ale, which was not very much but was not nothing, a penny for the ale, a fire that was already going, a room full of people who were all, in their different ways, doing the same thing, waiting for morning in the company of other people who were also waiting for morning. One more thing before we close: the yard behind the tavern. Because the tavern was not just the room you've been sitting in, it was an entire small compound, the main drinking room at the front, the kitchen behind it, the stable at the back for horses, a well or access to a water source somewhere in the complex, possibly a garden producing herbs and vegetables for the kitchen, possibly a midden heap at the furthest possible point from the building's most used spaces, and a yard connecting all of these things. The yard was a working space, a loading and unloading area, a place where barrels arrived and empty barrels were stored, where the stable boy moved between the horses and the building, where the kitchen waste was deposited, and where various animals circulated looking for that kitchen waste. It was not pretty. It was not intended to be. It was infrastructure. But the yard was also a social space in summer. When the building was full and the weather was warm, people brought their cups outside and sat in the yard, on barrels and fence posts, and whatever else presented itself as a surface. Informal games happened there, a form of bowling with wooden balls, early versions of skittles, informal wrestling among younger men, demonstrating strength to audiences, who responded with the particular vocal appreciation of people, watching an activity they find entertaining precisely because it isn't them doing it. Children played in the yard while their parents were inside. or helped with the small tasks of the tavern operation, carrying things and running messages, and absorbing the rhythm of the place through constant proximity. The horses in the stable at the back were a significant economic responsibility and a significant source of income for the establishment. Travellers with horses needed them fed, watered, and safely stabled overnight, and they paid for this service separately from the lodging fee. A good stable boy, one who kept the horses healthy, secure, and ready for morning departure, was a genuine asset to the establishment. A bad one, or an absent one, was a liability that could manifest in the form of a stolen horse, a sick horse, or a horse that was in some other respect not the horse the traveller left there the previous evening. There are court cases from the medieval period about exactly these scenarios. Stables robbed, horses exchanged, horses that were found to have been borrowed during the night and returned before morning. All the various ways that a large and valuable animal, kept in a semi-public space over a night of variable supervision, could attract the attention of people with interests contrary to those of the horse's owner. The well in the tavern yard was the establishment's water supply, used for washing, for cooking, and for the animals. It was not used for drinking by anyone who had access to ale for the reasons already discussed, but water was necessary for the brewing process and for everything else the kitchen needed, and the well's quality was therefore relevant to the quality of everything the kitchen produced. A good well, in a good location, away from sources of contamination, was one of the establishment's practical assets. A compromised well, polluted by whatever was happening geologically or sociologically in the surrounding ground, produced water that made everything it touched worse. Medieval people couldn't test their water. They could observe its taste and smell and the consequences of using it, and they could see whether people who used it stayed healthy or became ill, and they acted on this empirical observation with more sophistication than they get credit for. The tavern that moved its midden further from the well after noticing a pattern may not have understood the mechanism, but it was practicing epidemiology in the only way available to it. The travelling storyteller, when they passed through, was the biggest single evening enhancement the medieval tavern could experience. Not a musician, though musicians were valuable, but someone who told stories, long extended narrative accounts of events real or invented, saints' lives, heroic adventures, love stories, comic tales, historical accounts of varying accuracy. Medieval people were hungry for narrative, in the way that all humans are hungry for narrative, and in a world without books available to common people, without theatre accessible outside the largest cities, the travelling storyteller was a form of entertainment that was both rare enough to be exciting and skilled enough, at the best, to justify staying up later than you intended and drinking more than you planned. A really good storyteller could hold a medieval tavern room in silence for an hour, which is an achievement roughly equivalent to holding a modern room silent for an hour, without any technology, and against all the competing demands of a room full of tired and slightly drunk people. The stories that circulated in medieval taverns shaped what people believed about the world. Not official belief, that was the church's domain, but practical belief about human nature, about what kings were really like, about what happened in distant places, about what was possible and what was merely claimed to be possible. The fabliaux, the bawdy comic tales of medieval French literature, were tavern literature in essence, if not always in origin, short, punchy, organised around a reversal or a joke, designed for oral performance to an audience that wanted to laugh and recognise something true about the world in the laughter. The Robin Hood ballads, which circulated in English alehouses from the 13th century onward, were tavern entertainment. Stories about a man who took from the rich and gave to the poor, who made the sheriff of Nottingham look stupid, who lived in the forest outside the law and survived. These were not innocent entertainment. They were wish fulfillment for people who had very specific reasons to wish that the law was different, and that powerful men could be made to look foolish by ordinary ones. The tavern was where these stories lived, and where they were kept alive through telling, year after year, long before anyone wrote them down. This is the medieval tavern, not the sanitized movie version, not the dramatic setting for heroic narrative. Just a room where people came in from the cold and drank something, and sat by the fire and talked to each other, and eventually slept in the company of strangers and woke up and did it again. For 1,000 years, every night, in every town, without once thinking it was remarkable, because it wasn't. It was just life, conducted in the only space that was warm and open and available to everyone who needed it. And that was just one evening. Tomorrow the road continues, and the next tavern is 20 miles east, and the ale steak will or won't be out when you arrive, and the food will be what it is, and the bed will hold its ecosystem of other lives, and none of this will be pleasant in any way you would choose deliberately, and yet the fire, and yet the cup, and yet the simple fact of not being alone in the dark. That is the medieval tavern. That is what it actually was, underneath all the noise and smoke and historical distance. Not a set piece. Not a backdrop. A need, answered imperfectly. Continuously. For 1,000 years by the people who kept the steak over the door and the ale in the barrel and the fire going through the night. Sleep well, tomorrow the road is there. And somewhere down it the next alehouse, the next fire, the next cup of something that asks nothing from you, but your few coins and your company for an evening. And if you think tonight was interesting, wait until we talk about what was actually in the ale. Some of what they grew in that herb garden behind the tavern had effects that the church found particularly distressing, and the customers found particularly appealing. And the story of medieval brewing and the plants that went into it takes us somewhere considerably stranger than tonight's fire and frothy cup. But that is a story for another evening. There is one last detail that belongs in any honest account of the medieval tavern, and it is the detail that most people leaving this evening will carry with them on the road tomorrow, whether they intended to or not. It is the smell. Not the smell of the room, which was bad enough, but the smell that has transferred to you during your hours here. The wood smoke layered into your travelling cloak. The tallow from the guttered candles worked into the fibres of everything you were wearing near them. The yeasty sweetness of spilled ale absorbed into your boots from the floor rushes. And underneath all of that, the specific composite smell of an enclosed space where many people have been close together for a long time. You carry it with you on the road tomorrow. The horses in the next town's stable will be able to tell where you've been. The people you meet on the road will be able to smell it on you from 3 feet away. You smell, in the most precise sense, like a medieval traveller, which is to say you smell like someone who has been alive in the 14th century, which is an achievement, and you should not be ungrateful for it. The fire in the hearth has burned to coals, now still warm, but no longer casting light, just heat in the dark. The alewife has gone to bed at some point in the last hour. The accounts concluded, the door barred. The establishment's day formally ended, if not its night. The building makes its sounds, the timber settling, the thatch shifting, the continuous small life of the walls and floor carrying on in the dark. The people sleeping in the room above you are breathing in the irregular chorus of the deeply unconscious. Outside, the town has been silent for hours. The watch has long since passed, and will not pass again until before dawn. There is nothing between you and the morning, except time, and the morning is coming whether you meet it rested or not. The medieval tavern asks nothing from you once the cup is empty, and the account is settled. You came in from the cold. The fire was going. The ale was there. The company was imperfect and human and alive. Tomorrow you take the road again with the knowledge, held somewhere below the level of thought, that 20 miles ahead there will be another fire, another barrel, another alewife, with the same appraising look and the same steady hand with the cup. The network holds. The ale stake goes up when the barrel is ready. The door opens when you push it. That has been true for 1,000 years. It will be true tomorrow. It is, in its quiet and undervalued way, one of the more reliable facts about human civilization, wherever people travel, wherever people work, wherever people are cold and tired, and in need of somewhere to be for a few hours. Someone will have set a fire and filled a barrel and hung a bush over the door. All you have to do is push it open. Now, dim the lights all the way. The tavern is closing.